Good evening, all. My name is Tanmoy Mandal, the Head of Marketing, MSN Laboratory. Welcome all the master faculties and the guests for the live webinar on the management of pulmonary fibrosis and cytokine production in COVID-19 patient. Dr. Innovation resonates a sense of purpose in the evolution and existing of human life. The creative capacity of a human mind has always been the source of inspiration. We believe every life matters and everyone deserves quality medicine. Apart from the efficacy, affordability, and accessibility, we want to be the first to touch and impact human lives. We are MSN Research for Better Medicine. The quest for innovation drives us to serve you better and better today and tomorrow. MSN, the Research for Better Medicine, has one of the Asia's largest integrated pharmaceutical API and pharmaceutical R&D center at Hyderabad. With the global Indian pharmaceutical company, the global presence turnover crossing 600 million USD, present 65 countries globally, and 8 offices worldwide, including US and UK. 11,000 workforce globally, own the trust of more than 4 crore customers across 65 countries, and integrated state-of-art R&D centers and 14 manufacturing facilities in India and USA, making Tricolor proud. Research for Better Medicine. Indian spirit, making Tricolor proud, having 250 plus product in pipeline, 100 plus ANDA submitted in US, 600 patented globally, 25 products approved in US, 715 world largest DMF in US, 20 plus product entity approval in US, 45 dossiers submitted, and 70 products commercialized in US. MSN first time India launches starting from 2013, Prasugrel, Febuxostat, Tapentadol, Tolvaptan. 2015 we have come to the pH therapy, that is Bosentan. Then we come to Lansoprazole, Roflumilast. 2016 Lurasidone. 2017 Ambrisentan, Amlodipine, Celodocin, Azilsartan, Mirabegron, Mesitantan, Riociguat, and 2020 we have launched Trentine. And in 2020-21 we have launched the Dapavan, the brand of Dapagliflozin, Sacubitril Valsartan, Sacutan, Tofacitinib, Tofadose, and Brevanext. We are in partner in practice. MSN expertise of research and innovator brought first time India launches to support super specialists in bringing down Indian patient suffering. Who will be the better stand by you? A company with global research, global manufacturing, and global quality. Company which has acquired trust globally. We at MSN on a journey to serve you better and better. To partner in creating awareness in the management of pulmonary fibrosis and cytokine production in COVID-19 patient, approach for emerging treatment option that to increase patient life expectancy and quality of life. So before we start, I'd like to introduce our today's moderator, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, Director Medical Education and Head Pulmonary Medicine, Eras Lucknow Medical College and Hospital, Lucknow. Dr. Rajendra Prasad completed his MD and his fellowship in FSCC, USA, FRCP, and WHO Fellow in Japan. He is working presently as a Director Medical Education and Head Pulmonary Medicine, Eras Lucknow Medical College and Hospital, Lucknow. He holds position like Director in VP Chase Institute, University of Delhi, and Director in UPRIMS and RSAFI, and also Professor and Head Pulmonary Medicine, KGMU, Lucknow. He received many special awards and recognition like International Governor of ASTCP, USA, and Vice Chair, National Task Force, NTEP, India, and he is President of 5 major associations in chest medicine. He received many awards from Director Association like Dr. B.C. Roy National Award 2016, Lifetime Achievement Award, and India Association of Bronchology in 2016. He received PI Oration Award 2014, Vigyan Gaurav Award 2014. He received Dr. Reddy's Lung Cancer Orion Award 2013 and Professor Raman Vishwanathan Memorial Chest Orion Award 2012. He received DN Shivpuri Orient Award 2009 and UP Ratna Award 2004. He published 360 books chapter and 10 authorship of books including on TB and Atlas on fiber optic bronchoscopy based on Indian patient. So Dr. Rajendra, I welcome you for this program and hand over the session to you. Please, sir.
Thank you, Tanmay, for a very nice introduction, I believe. I don't know which I deserve or not, but let me, at the very beginning, let me welcome all of you for this very important webinar on pulmonary fibrosis and cytokine production in COVID times. It is very appropriate topic in COVID times. Today we are facing the second wave, which is really very problematic in the country. Tanmay, let me compliment first your company, MSN, for sponsoring this. I still remember when somebody came to meet me in Lucknow about 5-6 months back, and when they introduced me the perfenadine, especially in dose of very special doses like 267 and 801 milligram. At that time, let me talk from my heart. I probably understood, I'm meeting a company which is very innovative. And as I've seen your product by now, all the products, really, it gives me literally a pleasure to see these products, which can be very useful for India and whole of the world. With this little introduction, I would like to introduce our two great speakers and two panelists for this very purpose. We have Dr. Salil Bendre. I know him for last so many years. Whenever I see Salil, it reminds me of the professor who is no more now, who are associated with them, and he was good friend of my senior and good friend, and I just pay tribute to him on this occasion. But whenever I see Salil, I always remember him. So Salil, you know, probably needs no introduction. He is he's a ex-professor and head pulmonary medicine, KG Somaiya Medical, Mumbai University. He's expert in critical care management and HIV/AIDS. He has multiple papers, delivered a lot of lectures, national and international forum. So welcome, Salil. And then we have another very great speaker, Dr. Anis Agrawal, who is a senior consultant in rheumatology. Although the pulmonologist and rheumatologist has come very closer with the ILD, but with the COVID, I think again, we have come very closer because of the certain products which are being used in COVID also. And let me introduce Anis Agrawal. He is a rheumatology. He's a senior consultant in rheumatology in Puspanjali Medical Center, Delhi, Narendra Mohan Hospital and Heart Center, Mohan Nagar, NCR, and Combined Medical Institute, Dehradun. So he has his MD from KMC Manipal, and then he is a graduate from AFMC Pune, and he is unique qualification as he's a pain specialist and the rheumatologist, very few in the country, I believe. And he got the best fellowship award from American Heart Association and American Cardiology Travel Fellowship. Again, he presented many papers, published many papers, and then we have two young colleagues who will be helping me in a panel discussion. One is Dr. Samiran Upasni. He is MBBS, MD Medicine, and he is working in Fortis Hospital and Nityanand Nursing Home in Kalyan City, Thane. So welcome, Samiran. And then we have another young guy, Dr. Chetan Kumar, who is in Trinity Central Hospital, Bangalore. He's from Bangalore, and he is MD pulmonary medicine, and he won a lot of awards in NAPCON, and so welcome, Chetan Kumar also. So what I'm going to do for next maybe 20 to 25 minutes, the first talk will be taken by Dr. Anis Agrawal, and he will be talking on a particular drug, especially in scenario of COVID inflammation, especially the cytokine crisis. So welcome, Dr. Anis Agrawal. Please, now stage is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Rajandan, for such a kind introduction. And I welcome you all, the speakers and all the attendees. And definitely like to thank you for spending your time and coming forward to this deliberation. Just a small correction. I think in my introduction, I was, there's something about Fellowship of Cardiology was mistakenly put in. So kindly, Okay, so to start with, I'll be taking around 20 to 30 minutes to the ride of the, taking you through the ride of the cytokine storm, and hope to hijack or do the hijacking of the SARS-CoV-2. And I saw this terminology in one of the presentations, one of the publications way back in March 20, when it became very clear that probably the way forward in the management of COVID would be the JAK inhibitors. So with that introduction, we have to also understand that COVID-19 era hit us before we even knew what was coming. And we definitely had to go for, reintroduction or repurposing the existing treatment. That is the only way we could, finally find treatment for this disease, because we already knew the drugs and they were already certified for various uses. And when we repurposed them, we did find a lot of medicines, especially from rheumatology, that were, helping out with the cytokine storm that takes place during the COVID crisis. So this is from the Cytokine Signaling Forum, which is an international body. And I will be in this hijacking process, I'll be taking you through the phases of COVID, which just for introduction's sake, and cytokine storm, what it is and what really happens, the evidence with cytokine targeting in COVID-19, and then JAK inhibitors, what is the suggested repurpose for COVID-19. So as we all have seen it, there are three major phases of COVID-19. While most of the people are, 50% of the population who gets infected are asymptomatic, and only 50% left go through the, stage 1, 2, and 3 of COVID. And the early infection, you will have flu-like symptoms, and that will be about all, and 80% of the rest. So that reduces the count to somewhere around 10% who will be going into or maybe going into the pulmonary phase. And out of that 10%, only around 15% go on to the hyperinflammatory stage. And out of those 15%, we find about 5% have significant morbidity and mortalities. So these are the phases which we broadly know, and I think the internet has taught us all what is really happening. So what really happens as far as the kinetics and intensity of the antiviral response is concerned? Just a second. So, yeah. So we have to make a decision on when to treat and what to treat with. So understanding what really is happening, in the mild and moderate disease or severe disease, we have, the type 1 interferon response, which usually in a mild disease takes over the viral load and thereby reduces the, inflammatory cytokine formation. While once the disease is going to be severe, that is where the cytokine, the type 1 interferon response is not adequate, and the viral load is higher, and this leads to inflammatory cytokine, major presentation of inflammatory cytokine. And this is exactly where we, have to target these inflammatory cytokines. So in the early phase, antivirals or, type 1 interferon or hydroxychloroquine or maybe IL-7, these things have been worked upon. But once we have a cytokine storm coming in, that is exactly where we need to start, hijacking this and using various cytokine inhibitors to, overcome this storm. So what really happens is stage 1, we have a mild congestion, we have lymphopenia, increase prothrombin time, increase D dimers, LDH levels. Stage 2 is where we are really, looking at things where, there'll be shortness of breath, hypoxemia, PaO2, FiO2 more than 300 mmHg, more than 50% of oxygen would not suffice. And abnormal chest imaging would be there. Transaminase low, normal procalcitonins will also be, seen. So this is the phase where we are really concerned, and this is somewhere the area where, it will be wise to, target the immune system or do the, advise the corticosteroids and others. So unfortunately, right now there is a major panic in the in the medical fraternity as well as the public. The medicines are started at not the appropriate time. So I've seen patients getting steroids even in the early stage of the disease where they hardly even have fever, or they're just having a mild viremia and not going into any major pulmonary phase. So it is very difficult to hold it, because so much of I'll say ill knowledge that has been distributed through the internet. It becomes very difficult for the doctor to avoid prescribing the drugs that your patient already knows of, and there's so much of misuse. So there is a stage where we can start, and there is a stage we should not give these medicines, and this is what the natural progression of COVID-19 teaches us. So what really happens that there is the infection, and this leads to by activation of T cell, macrophages, neutrophils, the cytokines are released, and there's a cytokine storm where IL-1, interleukin 1, 2, 6 are elevated, TNF alpha is elevated, interferon gamma is elevated, and this total mix leads to major inflammatory cascade. And then there will be secondary infections, there would be respiratory distress. Then this could also lead to sepsis, multiple organ dysfunction, tissue damage, and then you have the PAMs and DAMs that will kind of make it a vicious cycle, and thereby we get the effect on the lung, the GI system, the brain, cardiovascular system, liver, kidney, and microcirculation in the eyes. So these are the afflictions that take place because of the tissue damages and the various things. It is not just the disease which has come and gone, it is also the post-disease sequelae which is important. So schematically, I'd like to, the pathological inflammatory cytokines that are released, how do they really and what do they really do? We have the interferon gamma, which is responsible for fever, impaired hemopoietic function, disseminated intravascular coagulation, and decreased serum proteins. Then there's TNF alpha, IL-1 beta, and IL-6 of special interest. We have fever, acute renal damage, anemia, and acute phase proteins. These are the ones that are escalating the inflammatory response to the infection. So what was the whole thing? That's why these cytokines became important. To those studies presented, we found that baseline presentation of IL-6 and TNF alpha levels were predictive of the outcome of COVID-19 infection. So what was found was that if you had elevated IL-6 levels, the outcome was poorer. We could predict that the patient is going to have more progression of the disease into more severe stages, and it will take longer. So while the same thing we saw with TNF alpha.
After completion of this doctor presentation, give me 2 minutes for us. We will introduce our brand, you rank us, then you continue the presentation.
Okay.
Right. So can I carry on?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. So
Sorry.
dexamethasone, then finally, when we understood that there's an inflammatory process in place, earlier, if you remember, the moment COVID was hitting us, we were actually trying to, tell people that avoid using dexamethasone. And that was basically because of this first phase. In the first phase, where the oxygen requirement is not there, those who were treated with dexamethasone versus those who got usual care, the outcomes were not as good. In fact, usual care was absolutely fine. So this is outcomes of the recovery mortality trial, and only those who were on to oxygen, those who needed, they're gone to second and third phase of the disease. They were the ones who benefited with the use of dexamethasone, and rightly there, because this is where the inflammatory process is taken on. The CRPs and the IL-6 starts increasing, and dexamethasone definitely work here. And while again, those who went into the fourth phase, where there was mechanical ventilation required, and once again here also dexamethasone did better than usual care. So with this, we got the information about the IL-6 inhibition by tocilizumab, which we were using already for rheumatoid diseases, and that was the first introduction of biologic into the treatment of COVID-19. And we got 8 RCTs in the COVID-19, where 4 met their primary end goal, 4 did not meet their primary end goal. So what was really the outcome was that there's a window of opportunity for using tocilizumab. It's no point giving it in a very severely lung damaged patient, or giving it too early where it's not needed, where the inflammation has not come in, where the cytokines have not been activated. So ideally it is to be given those patients who need 3 liters per minute, at least 3 liters per minute of oxygen to maintain the saturation of PaO2, what I'll prefer using, and those who are worsening even after the use of dexamethasone. And there are a lot of meta-analysis and a lot of studies and protocols being devised for the use of dexamethasone. And one of them is the Corimudo 19 TOSI protocol, where patients who are in WHO class 5, they are on oxygen with more than 3 liters per minute they need, and they're randomized between usual care and tocilizumab, and it was found that yes, in those patients, tocilizumab reduced the time for mechanical ventilation, reduce the deaths, and definitely reduce the the severity and the outcome of the disease. So this is the protocol that we're following. Now, once again, what is our monitoring aid? We have to look at the inflammatory cytokines. One of the easiest things, which as far as rheumatologists are concerned, we are so into it. Literally, we want to see it every time a patient comes to us, and this is something we've been using. So once again, it has been seen very clearly that if you prescribe tocilizumab or IL-6 inhibition, when the CRP is not elevated, the outcome, in fact, the benefit of tocilizumab is not as expected. So that was the flaws in the study. Why we are getting variable results, why we are not understanding, in a lot of patients we've given the drug and it is not working. So the point is, there's no use trying to introduce this when the CRP or the inflammation has not set in. But once it was elevated above 150, there you got a dramatic response of the use of tocilizumab. So definitely this is the area where we target the cytokine. So we have to keep a careful watch on the CRP levels and the IL-6 levels and all the inflammatory markers that are there. So once we have tocilizumab in our hand, a lot of misuse and use has been put forward. Then a lot of fears of various side effects. One of the major fears was the serious risk of infection. Now, that is what we saw majorly in the rheumatoid cohort, where we were using it regularly, monthly basis, and for long term, where the immunity is being suppressed extensively. But while in COVID, it's just a single therapy, or maybe maximally twice it is given. So this therapy really does not lead to any increase in rate of serious infections. So this is something which is not due to, we are seeing a lot of post-COVID infections, and Mucor has already made its headlines, and other diseases which are happening. So, but this tocilizumab is not the culprit here. and there's no risk of serious infections by using it correctly. That's what I'd like to say here. With this, I'll move on to the JAKs. Let's try to hijack the storm. And what exactly are JAKs? So something beyond biologics. So I would say they are the next generation to biologics. So JAK inhibitors are basically, they target the cytokine pathway by blocking all the cytokines. So they are blocking the cytokine receptors by what they do is there's a JAK-STAT pathway which leads to phosphorylation of the cytokines, and there is a good activity of dissociation from receptor to protein deactivation. So there's a JAK-STAT pathway which is actually something like working on multiple cytokines instead of working on a single cytokine, and it is something which definitely would be something down the line if you're talking about single cytokine targets with things like biologics or tocilizumab. So what are the different JAK families? We have JAK1, 2, JAK3, and type 2, and the various cytokines that are being affected. The interferon family is mainly being affected by JAK1, JAK2, and type 2, while we have also majorly of JAK1 and JAK2 are more important for the interferon family. And while another one of interest, instead of naming them all, I'll talk about IL-6, where JAK1, JAK2, and type 2 are important. And we all know that the two JAK inhibitors available in India are tofacitinib and baricitinib. And baricitinib is basically JAK1 and JAK2, targeting JAK inhibitor, while tofacitinib is JAK1, JAK3 mainly, and not to that extent in JAK2. But yes, JAK1, JAK2, and JAK3 targeted JAK inhibitor. So how does this affect in SARS-CoV-2? Baricitinib has a potential therapeutic role in the management of COVID through both its anti-inflammatory action and the numb-associated kinase or NAC inhibition. So NAC and NACs are involved in the function of clathrin, which mediates endocytosis of the COVID virus into the cell, resulting in the infection. So we have something, but unfortunately, there is a difference here. This is where the difference between baricitinib and tofacitinib actually lies. So baricitinib has an effect on NAC, while this effect is not really being seen by tofacitinib. So this part of the activity of NAC inhibition is the reason why baricitinib is touted as the better drug. In fact, worldwide, this thing is being put on to baricitinib, while tofacitinib is available and easily available in India today due to the pharmacological innovations we see in India. And that is why, for want of better and costly product, we go in for something that does work but does not have this action. Due to the anti-inflammatory effect of JAK inhibitors, it has also been speculated that they may be able to combat the elevated levels of cytokine observed in COVID-19, and thereby they've obviously reduced the severity of the infection. So this is something that takes control of the storm, or hijacks the storm. So this is what it is all about, the use of JAK inhibitors. So various studies were done with this postulation, and the use of JAK1 inhibitor and type 1 interferon ability to produce favorable clinical outcomes was studied by meta-analysis by Lucas Walls and his colleagues. So what this said was that JAK inhibitors and type 1 interferon have emerged as potential antiviral candidates for COVID-19 patients due to their proven efficacy against disease and excessive cytokine release, and their direct antiviral ability against viruses, including coronavirus, respectively. This is for interferon. So this is a study of 733 patients randomized, and 5 of the studies under this were published or unpublished. And this study also told us something more. It told us that those who were receiving JAK inhibitors had significant reduction of mortality, ICU admissions, and definitely they had increased odds of hospital discharge. So this is a favorable outcome, and definitely this is what we were looking for. We needed something to tide over the situation. And Let's talk about the targeted drug, that is tofacitinib. And there was a study published, very recently from Mayo Clinic, and this was done on a cohort on African American population, wherein they used tofacitinib with dexamethasone or dexamethasone alone. And in this study, where they had a cohort of 269 patients, 70% reduction in odds of dying among tofacitinib group was observed versus dexamethasone alone. So this was concluding that there is a definite potential benefit of tofacitinib also in the treatment of COVID, and especially when it is given along with dexamethasone. So repurposing tofacitinib definitely became an option, and it is something we can consider, considering the situation we are in. We don't have adequate baricitinib in the market, which definitely I would say is a better product because of the NAC inhibition property and directing JAK1 and JAK2, while we do have a lot of tofacitinib in the market, which is easily available. So the kind of population we have to handle, I think this is one thing which we have in the Indian market where we can consider using it. It can be repurposed. While it targets more than 50 cytokines, it's something like giving a broad spectrum antibiotic, something like doing that. And rather than targeting a single cytokine like IL-6 in tocilizumab or anakinra in IL-1. So I think this is another option which has been, proposed as a treatment or a support treatment for managing or reducing the severity of the disease. And definitely the best part is it's better tolerable. There is no metabolic problem with this. There's lack of hyperglycemia, and normally the usage is around 14 days, wherein the side effects which are expected for long-term usage of tofacitinib is also not that much. So this is something which definitely is another, kind of drug in our armamentarium in management of COVID-19. So there are multiple ongoing trials for this, which have not yet been published, and there are many more. I can just go on and on that. Multiple randomized double-blind trials have been done. Efficacy, safety trials have been done. And then the use in hospitalized patients have been done. So they are on the way, and they will be soon bringing us their, various outcomes. So another thing which has recently come up, and I've seen it also in a lot of my patients, those who were under tofacitinib treatment, the statement given by Goldberger et al. Was that, this person says that somebody was under treatment of tofacitinib and the whole family got infected, while, this person was spared. And I've seen that happening in around 9 or 8 of my patients who were taking JAK inhibitors. The whole family got infected. They had, up to stage 2, stage 3, up to that level of the disease, while this person was totally all right. But on the contrary, I've also had a patient who was under JAK inhibitors who we don't have that person any longer. So it is not something which is easy to say. We still say, I don't think we still have the whole picture. So that I think is just a thing we can share between, what we are experiencing. So with this, it's not all a hanky-dory. We have to understand that there are some issues we have to look into while, using tofacitinib or baricitinib, even, any of the JAK inhibitors. And one of the major warnings that there are is the risk of thromboembolism with the use of JAK inhibitors. And we have been seeing that as one of the major issues we've been tackling in use of JAK inhibitors in rheumatology. But the studies which are coming in, they're saying that since the use is so short, it's around 14 days, probably this is not the issue that we really need to worry about for such a short usage. But consequently, large observational study need accurately, we need accurate studies wherein we can, tell what exactly is happening. But this is what we saw in the, rheumatoid group. While we all understand about the Wiltshire triad, where there is an endothelial injury, and there's also stasis on the other end in those hospitalized patients, and this is leading to hypercoagulability. And we always, in all our patients, we are finding elevated D-dimers, IL-6 levels. This is what we are regularly doing. And definitely this is something which is also the reason that it's not just the JAK inhibitors that we're going to look at. So with this, it was recommended in that there were safety alerts with JAK inhibitors. FDA issued safety alerts in February 2019. In July 19, there was a black box warning, and then 19 European group also put up this warning. So it was recommended that risk mitigation strategies, including consideration of exclusion of patients with high thrombotic risk, treatment with standard or intermediate dose low molecular weight heparin prophylaxis during hospitalization, and considering the extended duration of thromboprophylaxis after discharge from hospital. Now, this is the important point I want to get there. Once we are using this drug, we normally, handle the patient till the patient is there with us. Once they are discharged, we tend to remove the use of heparin or thromboprophylaxis. So this is something that needs to continue, and you'll be seeing more and more those patients discharged well and good, and after 5 to 10 days, or probably during a convalescent period of 14 days, you're getting a lot of cases of thromboembolic phenomenon and MIs. So this is something that has to be, followed through after the treatment is done. So with this, let's get to what the Infectious Disease Society of America, what are the guidelines. They have said that corticosteroid, in the third phase, that is the hospitalized phase, they should be suggested. While in the second phase, where it's mild disease, you should not, it's suggested against the use of corticosteroids. So this is something which is a take home from what I'm trying to say, because there's no elevation of CRP at that level, and it wouldn't really be worthwhile. And definitely in a hospitalized patient, it is definitely worthwhile using it. Again, tocilizumab is best given early in the hospitalized phase, not in the later stage where things have really gone out of hand. And there have been studies with baricitinib and remdesivir combination. And once again, the early stage of cytokine storm, these are the drugs that could do wonders or could do something for us, and we could definitely think of using them. So with this, I'll like to close. And the take home I'd like to give is that reducing inflammation and inflammatory pathologies, inducing immunosuppression, and broad spectrum anti-inflammatory treatment, publishing, this is what JAK gives, and published evidence favoring responses, but we still a long way to go. We don't have all the studies which are still being done, frantically all over the world. The survival benefits in hospitalized COVID-19, I'm sorry about this, it's 19, COVID-19 patients has been seen, so definitely it's worth a try. And metabolic neutrality is something, because we all are seeing that heavy steroid load leading to a lot of problems of especially high glucose levels and insulin dependent conditions. So that is important aspect, and definitely suggested use of JAK inhibitors in COVID-19 is there. And we have to obviously individualize our patients and understand where we can use it. Again, the one of the bigger issues in India right now is that baricitinib is not available so openly, and it's like prohibitively costly. While tofacitinib is there, it is in reach, and definitely till for want of better medicine and want of better capabilities, I think tofacitinib is something that could be suggested as one of the things that could, again, I'll use the word, hijack the storm. So thank you so much for a patient hearing, and I'll hand over to moderator, sir, and let's see where it goes. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Anish Agarwal, for clearly highlighting the role of JAK inhibitors in management of cytokine crisis. At what stage and what should be the indication? Then telling something about the risk of little risk of thrombosis like thing, and then one more thing, what you told, probably it is in pipeline, it's used in preventive for the COVID. So once again, I thank you for a nice lecture. Please stay for the panel when there will be question answer. And now I am handing over to MSN. They want for a minute, I think. Somebody is from MSN?
Yes, sir.
Before I should go for Salil Bendre, please.
I like to highlight few things, sir. Once entire country was in a crisis, all metro cities facing the shortage of the medicine of COVID-19, and when the cases was in the high or in the surge. Antiviral drug remdesivir, favipiravir, Venice as a demand right for the COVID surge. Panic buying the case spike and the favipiravir shortage. When the products were out of stock, MSN take a lead and address the shortage of the COVID flu medicine and made the favipiravir the brand of Favilo, and tofacitinib, that is the Tofadose, made in available in all e-pharmacy like 1mg, Pharma AZ, MedPlus, Mayer, Apollo Pharmacy, Metros, every place has made it available. Not only that, sir, supporting COVID flu brands like Pulmofib, that is a Pirfenidone 267 and 801 mg tablets, and Dabigatran, that is Davifib, that also made it available. And not only that, sir, as we are discussing about the future molecules for this treating the COVID-19, so future advanced molecule that also MSN coming with. The first, that is Baridose, that is baricitinib tablet, selective genus kinase inhibitor. Sir was talking about this molecule. This molecule is US FDA issues the emergency use authorization also. Not only Baridose, MSN also coming with, that is Molnupiravir, that is the advanced antiviral drug, Molulo, that is a rapid action within 24 hours it shows, and complete suppression, it shows suppression with the virus transmission within 24 hours completely. And also MSN is coming with Avilo, that is arbitrary injection, that is synthetic vasoactive intestinal peptide. US FDA granted Aviptadil for the treatment of respiratory distress and COVID-19. So MSN is together, it's promised that together we fight with the COVID-19. MSN Research for Better Medicine. Our at present the medicine available, that is Favilo, Tofadose, Pulmofib, and Davifib, sir.
So
Thank you, sir. Now I'll hand over the session with Dr. Rajendra Prasad ji.
Thank you, Tanmay. Once again, what you have shown that indicates that company is moving towards the innovative drugs, and my best wishes to you. And after this, can I, Dr. Anis Agarwal is here. Anis, you are there?
Yes, sir, I'm there.
Can you tell the audience about the dose of this tofacitinib? What is being used in?
Yeah, so the usual dose in rheumatoid arthritis is 5 mg twice a day.
Yeah.
Okay, that is the usual dose, but it has been recommended that you can use 10 mg twice a day for the first few days, and then reduce it to 5 mg later. So again, since it is still not in the clear approval, studies have used it variably. But I think I can say from what I gather from the Rheumatology Fraternity of India, the IRA. So I've been getting feelers from a lot of people who have used it at 10 mg twice a day and then reduced it later. Because this is short-term use, we can go higher. Okay. But again, we have to depend on the levels of CRP or the inflammatory storm that is taking place. So that, and it works very fast, just within 12 hours to 24 hours. And a lot of our patients that have used it, within 24 hours, you start seeing things happening. And that is a wonderful thing to see.
Thank you, Anis. Now in this session, we have a second speaker, which I have already introduced, Dr. Salil Bendre. And he will be talking, now in COVID era, a lot of talk on pulmonary fibrosis, whether COVID itself is COVID. No doubt, some of the patients are moving to develop the pulmonary fibrosis. Although the percentage are very few, but if you see in the numbers, large number of person will be in India will be there. And what would be the approach? What should be the management? I think we have Dr. Salil Bendre to talk about the pulmonary fibrosis, a longer lasting life-threatening symptom. So now I invite Dr. Salil Bendre. Now stage is yours, Salil.
Good evening, sir. Sir, am I audible to everyone?
Yes, you are very well audible.
Okay. So as you said, sir, right? When I saw you, I definitely remembered Mohanty sir, because we
Yeah.
have been associated with you because of his conferences and all his academic ventures, and he has actually taken our younger lot into meeting you and interacting with you, senior teachers like you. So definitely his blessings are with us always, and we remember him every moment. So just going on with pulmonary fibrosis as a part of post-COVID syndrome, which we are seeing. I'll be going a little fast with the slides because there has to be more of an interaction rather than just the number of slides which I have put up. I think all of the doctors who are treating COVID have also seen a group of patients who are difficult to be taken off the oxygen. They are treated for COVID, the fever settles down, their cough persists but much lesser, but they tend to remain breathless. When they go to the washroom also, their saturation drops to 85. And at the time of discharge also, their oxygen remains 88 to 89, and they are constantly made to take oxygen. And they are told that you will have to go home on oxygen. So there are that group of patients who land up with what is called or what is labeled as post-COVID syndrome, which is primarily pathologically denoted by the fibrous tissue which is formed in that particular area in the lungs. Now, if we go to just this particular slide, we can see figures of 81%, 14%, and 5%. So everyone will agree with me that almost 80% of our patients get better when they are treated even by home treatment. They really don't need to get hospitalized. There are those patients who are in the mild category and they have fever for 4 to 5 days. They are given supplements and they stabilize. There are about 14 to 15% of the patients who get hospitalized, who need oxygen, who need IV steroids, who need to be monitored, and even they recover. And of course, a very small patients group which succumbs by getting ventilated or respiratory distress. Now, today we are going to discuss about what will be the outcome of the patients who have recovered also, but yet they become symptomatic. Okay, so there are increasing number of patients who have survived this COVID-19. They have been clinically tested as negative, but they persist to have symptoms. So symptoms could be in the form of breathlessness, fatigue, body ache, tiredness, oxygen dependency. They are on oxygen at home as well. So what should be done for them? And the most common outcome which is seen by us clinicians is the post-COVID fibrosis. And this is obviously going to be an outcome because every inflammation ends by fibrosis. That is not anything new that I'm telling you about. May it be tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is also an inflammatory disease of the bronchi and the airways. And finally, it lands up either as a fibrocystic disease or cavities or bronchiectasis or post-TB fibrosis as a sequelae of tuberculosis. So similarly, if there is a fulminant inflammation of the airways, of the parenchyma, of the interstitium, it is bound to be healing or it is bound to be ending up as fibrous tissue. And we very well know that we really don't have anything to cure fibrosis. We can't have any medicines which reverses fibrosis and it goes away. And that's one of the also reasons where we are dealing with problems related to interstitial lung disease, who are having fibrosis and honeycomb appearance and multiple cysts, and virtually they become gradually more and more oxygen dependent. So same phenomenon is seen in these COVID patients as well, where radiological changes have been seen even as early as 3 weeks. Usually we label fibrosis, okay, fibrosis is a long-term disease, so it has to come up after 6 months, after 1 year, and then there is a fibrous change in the lungs. But COVID has shown that fibrosis changes have been detected as early as 3 weeks after the onset of symptoms, which is definitely much earlier than what we comprehended. And since we are in the second year of this pandemic, now we see OPD patients with fibrosis who have got past history of COVID. We never used to ask, we have always asked past history of pneumonia, past history of tuberculosis, what is your occupation, are you exposed to any dust, are you exposed to to any chemicals. But now looking at the fibrous tissue on the CT scans, and if we ask them, did you have COVID in the past? And the answer is yes. So there are a lot of patients who have post-COVID sequelae. And in the students who are going to be taught now in MBBS, there will be this definitely past history of COVID you need to ask. So 5 years down the line, 6 years down the line, we'll have a number of cases who will have post-COVID fibrosis as a sequelae, and they would be coming to the doctors on OPD basis. So there are risk factors for that. I would put up here that the most important risk factor, which I feel everyone should realize, is the ICU stay, moderate to severe disease, requiring high flow oxygen. So these are the three main points which can actually lead you to understand that this gentleman or this person is possibly going to go into a post-COVID fibrosis. More the disease, he's getting admitted into the ICU, requires more than 5 to 6 liters of oxygen to maintain his saturation. Patient is requiring high dose of steroids also for that matter. These are the patients who will be the most possible group who would be landing up with post-COVID syndrome. And as far as the pathogenesis of fibrosis is concerned, I think it is very, very clear now that SARS-CoV-2 is actually all functioning through the angiotensin converting enzyme. And then, of course, the cytokine storm through the different mediators, as the previous speaker has explained to you, and related to the interleukin 6 and also the tumor necrosis factor. So it is all a pro-fibrotic, pro-inflammatory process which the virus goes through. And CT scan picture is not new now. I think everyone knows about the ground glass, patchy opacity, subpleural, which is very, very typical of a COVID pneumonia. But what we are seeing subsequently is a lot of traction bronchiectasis, a lot of fibroelastosis and scarring. And this is where we have to do something. We know about remdesivir, we know about steroids, we know about oxygen therapy also. Now we have also realized about the role of JAK inhibitors also. But there are these group of patients who are still with us in the hospital. They have recovered of COVID, but they still need high flow oxygen, and the CT scan is showing a lot of fibrous tissue. There are multiple documents which have actually outlined the different changes on the CT scan, especially in the elderly age group, but not only that, even in the younger age group. So age is not a barrier. Usually we suspect in terms of a IPF or an interstitial fibrosis that it would be in the middle age to the elderly age group. But since SARS-CoV-2 is affecting all age groups, and of course in the younger age group we are seeing in the second wave, even they are getting definitely affected by the post-COVID fibrotic lung, which we are seeing. And there is a simple flow chart for any patient having interstitial lung disease. This is not related to COVID, but a basic flow chart of how to go about evaluating a patient who comes to you with a CT scan suggestive of interstitial changes, which could be septal thickening, which could be honeycombing, which could be traction bronchiectasis. And CT scan classification tells us whether it is a UIP pattern, indeterminate for UIP, and so on and so forth. And we go ahead with a biopsy to prove the cause or the etiology of that particular interstitial lung disease. Coming to the management of pulmonary fibrosis, I think every one of us knows that we actually are dealing with only 2 antifibrotic agents. Since we are dealing with a lot of interstitial fibrosis, we have 2 molecules in the usage. One is the pirfenidone and second is the nintedanib. These are not new molecules for us because we have been treating chronic HP, we have been treating IPF, we have been treating fibrotic IPF also, fibrotic ILDs with these 2 molecules. So these are again molecules which we have used. We know their adverse reactions, we know their side effects, we know we need to monitor the liver enzymes. We also know that they can cause skin eruptions or skin allergies. However, we need to also know that this time, how does it help in a COVID patient or in a post-COVID lung fibrosis? So there are definitive mode of actions which have been shown, which talks about the pirfenidone being against the anti-inflammatory fibrosis and oxidation and attenuates the lung injury because pirfenidone reduces the LPS-induced acute lung injury. It downregulates the cytokines. It affects the connective tissue growth factors. It affects the tumor necrosis factor. And not only that, it actually downregulates the ACE receptor expression, which is one of the major receptors in COVID-19 pathogenesis. So this is actually the bottom line of why we are talking today of antifibrotics, because all the mechanisms of pathogenesis and further on to fibrosis are being affected or by the mode of action of pirfenidone falls into this. It makes an appropriate treatment in terms of its anti-apoptotic and the anti-fibrotic effects. And there are guidelines about the dosages and how to use it. I think that everyone would be aware of. What we need to be a little concerned is about the SGOT, SGPT, alkaline phosphatase monitoring, because some patients of ours could be alcoholics. Some patients of ours could have just recovered from a multi-organ failure. Some patients of ours could have a compromised liver. So please remember that in these patients, if we are starting antifibrotics, we need to be more careful. Also, one word of caution is that nintedanib is also being used by some of us as a antifibrotic. However, the only issue with nintedanib is that it has an interaction with the anticoagulants, which are also being used in COVID patients, and that is something which may cause problems for our patients because of this interaction. So, though they are antifibrotics in their own ways, compared to nintedanib, pirfenidone is safer in terms of usage in our patients of post-COVID. I will tell you one observation, and also there are papers on that those patients who have actually received tocilizumab have got a more fulminant fibrosis. I cannot vouch that it is that all patients of them are getting it, but since this paper definitely talks that if you give tocilizumab, then there are a subgroup of patients who develop more fulminant fibrosis. The cytokine storm may be tackled at that moment of time, but the CT scan, which is done after 10 days or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, is definitely showing more fibrous tissue. And that is also the experience of many of my colleagues who have seen them, that they develop these fibrous tissue which are difficult to be managed. So I think we need to realize that we are dealing with a pandemic, the acute stage definitely, but we also will be having a plethora of cases who will be landing up in our OPD as post-COVID fibrosis. So anti-IL-6 usage in the early phase may actually predispose to fibrous tissue formation and may precipitate more fibrosis. Now, I should be making a disclaimer here that it has not come into the guidelines. One, there are not many randomized controlled studies to say that this is the drug of choice and it has to be used. The third aspect is about the duration. Again, we are very, very new to this particular disease. We have not even crossed 2 to 4 years of observing these patients of post-COVID fibrosis. Another deterrent, which I suppose everyone should know, that usually when there is an interstitial lung disease, we tend to monitor them by doing a lung function test and a DLCO, the diffusion studies. However, with the COVID pandemic going on, a lot of centers which were doing the lung function tests are presently not doing them because it's an aerosol generating and a high risk procedure. So we are not in a very, very good situation to monitor the progression of this disease or to know how it has improved. But I can tell you that there are good papers in many reputed journals which talk about an improvement in the 6-minute walk test and the improvement in the FVC of these patients who have been put on antifibrotics. So there are other treatment options, but steroids have no role to say in fibrosis, because once the fibrosis sets in, steroids have no role to play. So let's understand that. So I would just like to tell our viewers that in case your patient is having post-COVID fibrosis, there is formation of septal thickening, taper down their steroids and stop them, though they may be breathless, because that is not going to help them. Rather, it may predispose to other infections. And of course, coming to patients who have a PaO2 FiO2 ratio less than 50 and a PCO2 more than 60, tissue plasminogen activator. But again, today we are primarily talking of antifibrotics in terms of the specific drugs of pirfenidone and nintedanib. There are other drugs which I'm not going to detail about, remdesivir and lopinavir, but we very well know that they are actually to be used in the active phase and not to be used when we are talking of the fibrotic phase. Every molecule has a specific role to play when we talk of COVID. And same is true for antifibrotics also. There are divided opinions on this. I know very well in certain that there are divided opinions that why we need to give antifibrotics. The fibrosis in COVID actually resolves by itself. That is one of the opinions which comes up. But we need to have a long-term study. We need to have real good data from our own patients, and only then we can actually either support it or not support it. But whatever data I have gone through and whatever we have as of now, it is showing to improve the FVC in patients whose lung functions have been done. It is showing to improve the 6-minute walk test and the exercise capacity. And it is one molecule which is available and it can be monitored. So I just wanted to put these thoughts very clearly so that there's a clear-cut take-home message about COVID-19 and antifibrotics and the mechanism of pirfenidone and the safety of pirfenidone in terms of the anticoagulation. So I think I will just stop at that and we will have a good discussion ahead. So thank you so much for giving me a patient hearing, and I hand over to Dr. Rajendra Prasad, sir.
Thank you, Salil Bendre, for clearly highlighting the role of antifibrotics in post-COVID fibrosis, especially. And although I know that, as you told, that there are still a lot of controversies, the use of antifibrotics as we have seen, people are very frequently using these drugs. Up to what should be the duration? So there are still some questions which has to be, that there are some queries which has to be answered. Probably, as you said very rightly, that we are just about 1.5 years in the COVID. So many of the things even we do not know, and it will evolve as the time will pass on. So once again, thank you, Salil. Now we go to the, I think 2 other panelists are there, will join. My first question to you, Salil, to you itself, is as you know that we have discussed, somebody has acute phase is over COVID and he has come to home or even in a hospital, and he has some residual lesion in the CT scans, and he has some symptoms. He may not have those symptoms also. So naturally, you have to fine tune that when to use steroids, when to stop steroids, when to use and when to add antifibrotics. To me, Salil, it looks like non-fibrosing IPF-like pictures than when other people, other than IPF, when they develop fibrosis. So apart from the antifibrotic drugs, you have to also use the immunomodulator or the anti-inflammatory drugs also. So here the same thing is probably true in COVID also, I believe, that probably, and COVID will come probably in the same scenario. Say fibrosing ILD, non-IPF fibrosing ILD. So a lot of things has to be done. So my question to you, how you fine tune in which patient, suppose a post-COVID patient who has acute crisis is over, he has become negative, he has some shadows in the CT scan, and how you monitor them, and what would be the place of steroid, then how much of steroid is to be used, and then when the antifibrotics has to be added. So I would start with you, Salil, and then I'll invite the other panelists to answer.
Sure. So that's a very important question. So as far as the steroids, I think we are all on one page. We are very clear with the role of steroids, that it's a very good anti-inflammatory. Starting from the 7th day onwards and patient landing up in the ICU, he needs oxygen, he's hypoxic, CT scan is showing active ground glass or alveolitis. And we are controlling it by say 5 to 7 days of the IV steroids and put him on an oral dose, which would be methylprednisolone, because that is the drug of choice, or Dexa, because now the task force is recommending Dexa or methylprednisolone. The dose they have said is 0.5 milligram per kilogram and tapered fast. We should not continue it for 1 month or 2 months, because diabetes, hypertension, peptic ulcers, reflux, and opportunistic infections. So the role of steroids is for 10 to 15 days and then tapering. So that is very, very clear. The question comes about when will we start antifibrotic and in whom we will start antifibrotic. So we are possibly now these are, we can call as off-label decisions or my view kind of decisions, because everyone is now giving my opinion and off-label usage. But CT scan is a very good radiological assay of understanding septal thickening, traction bronchiectasis, and for that matter, even the areas of fibrous disease. So as you said rightly, non-IPF type of changes, which we can, as pulmonologists, we can definitely make out and understand. So one is radiology, but more importantly, the clinical scenario. patient who is requiring oxygen, patient who is having 6-minute walk test, he cannot perform and he desaturates, which means his lung is having diffusion defect. His lung requires something to prevent further fibrosis. I think clinical criteria, radiological criteria are very important. And then I would be starting them on an antifibrotic agent, and I would be calling them for a follow-up for a month or two. And in my opinion, I would again do a CT scan after about 6 to 8 weeks to see what is the situation in his lungs, and 6-minute walk test at that instance also. So that is where I would place steroids and antifibrotics.
Thank you, Salil. Now we have with us Dr. Chetan Kumar.
Yes, sir.
Yes. What you are doing and what you have to say in this?
Yes, sir. My approach is a bit aggressive, sir. As sir discussed rightly, corticosteroids, I am using just methylprednisolone because we all know that it's the most penetrating drug to the lung. So I have not used much of dexamethasone, though the guidelines say I am more preferable for the methylprednisolone. So there is a clear-cut, evidence or a clinical approach where there is a sudden drop in saturation, pulse oximetry of 4 to 5%, increased symptoms indicating cytokine storm. So I hit hard early, sir. I hit hard, hit fast. So that's where I use even up to 250 mg IV stat and OD methylprednisolone for 3 days. Then I taper it off soon. Then in those patients who continue to depend on oxygen, then I immediately put on pirfenidone with a low dose, starting with 200 mg, then go up to 400 mg. So again, there is a lot of discussions. Either it is ongoing fibrosis or it's going for IPF kind or a non-IPF kind of thing. But what my experience of seeing almost so many 5,000 cases since the first wave, there is benefit even with oral steroids tapering dose with pirfenidone also. In some patients, pirfenidone is helping. In some patients, oral steroids are helping. So for those patients who are heavily dependent on oxygen, even after discharge of doing 6-minute walk test, I am giving a tapering dose of oral steroids with a low dose of pirfenidone. And then in the follow-up, I'm stopping both according to the clinical condition.
Right. Dr. Samiran, what you have to?
Yes, as rightly mentioned by Sir Dr. that pirfenidone does have a role in even acute phase. It definitely improves oxygenation and prevents damage of more alveoli with whatever mechanism it is. So we are using pirfenidone very early with steroids, and all patients who are requiring oxygen, we are putting them on pirfenidone. So I know it is a antifibrotic drug, but it does have some role even in acute phase. So I will not say that it is the main drug in acute phase, but we are starting it early, and definitely we are looking at patients in the post follow-up scenario, and most of the patients are also willing to know how much percentage of the lung is damaged, and definitely we are repeating scan after 1.5 months, and in few cases we have repeated scan up to 6 months, and we have stopped it when the activity looks to be complete. So few patients we have given pirfenidone up to 6 months also, and then stopped. Once I thought the damage is complete and there is no progression, then we have stopped.
Dr. Anis Agrawal,
Yes.
you have to say something regarding this also? Although
I just, from what I gather, probably I'm nobody to interject in this. What I gathered from Dr. Chetan, that there was some use of oral steroid and pirfenidone, and probably you're not being able to understand, in which cases things would do better with the use of steroid, and in which cases pirfenidone should be, targeted. So I don't know. My take as a rheumatologist will be look for inflammation. If there is inflammation, then steroid probably would do something good. And the simplest markers are the CRP and the ASR levels. Probably that could, help us out in making the judgment what would be a better option. And like Dr. Samiran said, that once the damage is already done and there is no regression or progression, I don't think anything can work there. So, I mean, that's all I see. Rest, I think it's you people are judges.
to add on, Anis, I totally agree with you that once you establish that there is a part of inflammation, then probably steroid has got some role to play, and then at what stage antifibrotics, although the word is divided, at what stage is to be added, but depend upon the clinical situation. Now I'll put another scenario to all of you. Now, acute phase of COVID is over. He has been mild to moderate illness, has been to hospital, required some oxygen for some days, came back. Now we got CT thorax done, and CT thorax has shown shadows in the CT. Now he is off the oxygen, his saturation is maintained, but in CT thorax, they say the shadows are more than 50% or 40%. Some are mostly having some, interstitial thickening, even some ground glassing is also there. That is the usual picture even in post-fibrosis, in post-COVID also. Now, what should be the management at this scenario? There could be two types of management. One, that one can wait and see the follow-up, and another, because he is patient is without oxygen, he is maintaining saturation. Only problem now, people are asking us question. Only problem that they have a shadow in the chest in CT, and shadow may be a mild one, maybe moderate one, and maybe, of course, in a severe where large extent of involvement is there, oxygenation should be low. But in scenario where oxygenation persons are maintaining, then what should be the management at? But they have definite shadow. What should be the I will start with Salil again.
Yeah. So that's the most difficult situation to take a decision, actually. But I think we have got fair idea about a couple of things. One is that, fortunately, I can say that these post-COVID fibrosis are showing a good response compared to the usual fibrosis patients which we were seeing before COVID, may it be in the form of chronic sarcoid or chronic HP, subacute HP, or those with even connective tissue related ILDs and so on and so forth. So comparatively and thankfully, after 3 months or 4 months of the treatment given, as you rightly put out, the oxygen requirement is settling down, and clinically also they are becoming better. Radiological improvement may take a longer time, and if there is a fibrous tissue, it may actually not show a significant change also. So if the patient is having asymptomatic and his saturations are off air, maintained on 96 to 97% saturation, my take is to stop the antifibrotics. That is my, again, a personal view. But I would follow up this patient every 3 monthly. And till now, I have not seen a patient where after stopping it, again, the fibrosis has increased, or he starts coming to us with again an hypoxia, unless they get some other cause of hypoxia, not related to the post-COVID problems.
And in such patients, Salil, suppose you are tapering the steroids. So suppose as consensus has been, then in a post-acute phase, if you want to use steroid, it is the methylprednisolone is the drug of choice. So what should be the dose of methyl? As somebody said, it should be in 0.5 milligram per kg body weight, and it should be tapered off in next 2, 3, 4 weeks time, depending on the clinical scenario. So what you want to say?
So, yes. So steroids, I haven't given steroids for more than a month. Possibly for the longest I have given is maybe for a month, but that too not in a large number of patients. Usually after 2 to 3 weeks post discharge, I have found that steroids, the role of steroids, and as Dr. Aniruddha correctly pointed, I think we should be making use of our biomarkers to really know whether steroids to be continued or we need to stop them off. I think that's the perfect time we should be doing.
Yes. Dr. Chetan?
Yes, sir. Yes. So pretty much same, sir. Those patients, who are presented early to the hospital, who have taken the right medicines at the right time, those patients are, getting discharged in a very better fashion. And we are not seeing much of complications also. And those patients who are come late with a saturation of 85, less than 85, 88, those are the ones who you're prolonging the hospitalization, hospital stay, and even going after discharge also, they're dependent on oxygen and tapering steroids for a long time. So we have seen only, few of the cases. So that's why I'm, more keen on educating people also to come early to the hospital and, be little aggressive in the treatment approach also. So as sir said, exactly those patients, who are recovered well with a saturation of post 6 minute walk test of 95, 95% saturation even after 6 minute walk test, I have not, I would immediately stopped off the steroids and even Perfenadone tablet also, and follow up after 1 or 2 months, they are better. They're doing well. Only some very few cases have landed up in, tuberculosis or mucormycosis, very rare incidents. But as my my colleagues and my practices of more hitting are hit fast early in the during the cytokine storm and tapering of the steroid storm. Then those patients who are dependent on oxygen, we add a low dose of Perfenadone. Then that also we are stopping off during discharge time or at least in the first follow.
Thank you. Dr. Samiran, your
I have a separate
Your
view.
say?
I have a separate view, especially in this second wave. What I have seen here is people getting admitted, whatever the dose which is guided by the expert doctors they have given. Sometimes saturation is 91, 92. Patients are discharged after probably 6 to 7 days of remdesivir and steroid. They go home and come back again with severe breathlessness. And you see that their saturation is gone to 60. You do the CT scan and you will see actually the CT scan is same, or in some people the opacities have increased. This is I've seen since last 1 month. And then now we are labeling these people not as post-COVID but long COVID. So this is long hauler or long COVID. So long hauler or long COVID, initially we used to have only somatic symptoms, body aches, headaches, rashes. But here in the last 1 or 1.5 months, I have seen patients admitted at different hospitals now coming to my hospital, or even my own patients whom I discharged them early, looking at the non-availability of the beds, and they have come back with much drop in saturation. So initial dose of steroid in this second wave is higher than what it used to be the last wave. So that is what we have learned from our own experience, that though if you have used 40 milligram twice a day or some in the first wave, in second wave that doesn't work. You have to go to higher doses, or your patients go home and come back. So that's what I have observed, and I am looking them as a long COVID rather than fibrosis.
Yes, I totally agree with the doctor, because what people are doing, as you see the guidelines, they say that steroid is for 5 to 10 days. So what they are doing after 5 to 10 days, they are stopping the steroid. And ideally in this second wave, the pulmonary involvement is much higher. The shadows are there. So one has to be careful. Probably the steroid first has not to be stopped all of a sudden. There has to be tapered it off. And depending upon the clinical scenario and radiological picture and other things, how you taper off, this is the clinical's own judgment. And so that the patient should not come back. So that should be the idea. And at that appropriate time, you may think of, especially in patients whose oxygen is less, they are more symptomatic, shadows are very much, and there is evidence of some fibrotic changes. There, I think the place where one can think of using the antifibrotic drugs. That one has to be very careful. But what we have seen, what the studies has also shown, that in some of the long haulers who had not much symptoms, who had only shadows, COVID has negative, their shadows will disappear in next 3 to 6 months time. And in previous MERS and other infections, we have seen this. Probably this is also going to happen with this also. So some of the patients, to my understanding, if they are pretty asymptomatic, only the shadows are there, we can only use steroid, taper it off as soon as it is possible, because long use of steroid also carry a lot of issues that are there. So what I believe, one has to fine tune and make a balance so that the ultimately patient gets benefit. I think with these, can I put another question to panelists? Although today topic is not there, but people are a lot of having detailed discussion around the use of, everybody says that somebody is hospitalized when one has to use the thromboprophylaxis. There's no doubt about it.
May I just add a small thing? My two bit from what I understand. From one of the dilemmas which you all are facing is that there are shadows in the chest even after the treatment, and you want to know what to do with them. Patient is maintaining a good saturation. But
Yes.
sir, what I understand, saturation is one of the very poor markers of
Yes.
it is ABG. That is what you should be doing in such stages. That is what will tell you how to take this forward, I feel. If we do an ABG and we understand that the PO2 is not well maintained or PCO2 is going, higher than it is, then probably that is the time to continue your management. That's what I feel. That's what.
No, you are right. In some of the patients who are symptomatic and they probably ABG, I think 6-minute walk test is also a much better indicator. Six minute walk test if you do, and that gives you the indication what is happening inside.
Sir, and one doubt, sir, these blood markers are not exactly correlating to the clinical picture. We have seen patients on ventilator with low CRP. We have seen patients with, walking, talking in the ward with high CRP. So that was the experience right from the first wave also. So I am more of going into the clinical scenario actually with the symptoms, with the pulse oximetry and how they're, clinically progressing. Because what I've seen is first we used to depend on the CRP, D-dimers, but there was no correlation for many of the cases. That I want to share the experience and I want to know from others also.
No, I fully agree with you because clinical application is much more important. That is definite. Secondly, in these patients which we are talking of lung disease, interstitial lung disease, we do not see CO2 as a parameter and we cannot monitor ABGs to really, understand. And ABGs will not decide whether steroids are to be given or antifibrotics are to be given. That's a completely different ballgame. So here, 6-minute walk test is the most crucial screening method to know what's happening in the lungs. That is one. One thing to Dr. Samiran, I'll tell you that if we have a moderate case who needs remdesivir for 5 to 6 days or who needs oxygen to maintain the saturation, preferably at least we are not discharging them on the 6th day or the 7th day. Okay, because there are a biphasic evolution of these patients where they improve, then they again worsen, then again improve. So I suppose we need to really observe them. And second is a repeat CT scan most often shows an increase in the shadows because by the time they have got an organized pneumonia and areas of fibroelastosis. So if the patient gets admitted, as you know, on the day 8 and you see a CT scan and you do a CT scan on day 16 or 15, it is obviously going to show an increase in the shadows. The patients which you are particularly saying that they become hypoxic or they drop in the saturation, that is something which is really worrisome and we need to tackle them in a different way of handling, as you rightly pointed out.
People have come back more hypoxic. They were discharged with 6-minute walk test and it was okay. And we were taking time up to 10 days. We were taking time in the first wave just because of the scarcity of the bed and people on waiting list and also.
Correct.
We decided that we might discharge them early and we have educated people that they might come back also.
Absolutely. Patients don't take their oral anticoagulants at home properly also. That one thing we have noted. So we usually
now I think the last question I'm going to put in front of all of you is the oral what I was talking, that somebody discharged from the hospital is doing ill. What is the actual role of these oral anticoagulants while in home convulsing? What guidelines says? Salil, you may start with.
So guidelines are very clear. One is at least everyone should know that ecosprin should not be given. That is firstly, that message should go away even for home treatment because the pathophysiology of the hypercoagulable state is different from the platelet related problems which we see. So that is the first thing. Secondly, the recommendation wise, it is low molecular weight heparin for moderate to severe cases who are admitted. That is the second thing. Patients who are getting discharged, they have been supposedly better with novel oral anticoagulants, which would be either dabigatran or rivaroxaban or apixaban, whichever is the drug of choice or experience. However, we need to monitor them because there are problems which have happened in terms of bleeding, in terms of gastric bleeds, in terms of bleeding PR, in terms of hematuria. So it is not like once the patient is going home, that means just prescribe on the discharge card and that the matter is over because they are on blood thinners, they are on anticoagulants. So those Now, what I do again, see, as far as the recommendation, I have not seen those have been told to take NOACs, but comorbid patients, bedridden patients, elderly patients, patients who have got moderate to severe disease, 4 weeks of oral anticoagulation post discharge is, I suppose, a better way to go ahead. I think everyone can give their ideas on that.
Yes, yes. Chetan, what you have to say?
Sir, I also recommend even those mild cases, mild COVID cases, coming vulnerable group especially, I do start upfront anticoagulation, oral anticoagulant, so that there is one study, where it's telling at least 28%, reduction in hospitalization if we start early in the mild COVID cases. And I have seen by my experience of those patients, especially ischemic heart disease patients who are regularly taking the dual antiplatelets, suffering less compared to those patients with, no history of any antiplatelets or any oral anticoagulants. So definitely the patients are dying with only two things, either from lung fibrosis or with, clots. So those early patients, means those mild cases who were started with either dual antiplatelets or with a novel oral anticoagulants are doing much better compared to other cases. So I do recommend all our GP practitioners, even back in Bangalore or Karnataka, even in my educational videos also, to start early in the mild COVID cases upfront with a novel oral anticoagulant or a dual antiplatelets according to the patient's affordability and their this thing. And
Which of the oral coagulants your preference, Chetan?
my preference is pretty much.
I mean, oral coagulants, that should be the preference which require hardly any monitoring, because in the OPD basis you have to be careful.
Yes,
So which
I prefer, sir, compared to other, because I have seen lesser bleeding complications compared to
which one?
Dabigatran.
Dabigatran, okay. And then Samiran?
When we are thinking of anticoagulant for hospitalized patients, we are thinking only low molecular weight heparin. 5 days, 7 days, 10 days, maybe
Yes,
14 days.
that's clear.
And once they are discharged, we look at their initial D-dimer. If the initial D-dimer was very high in thousands, definitely they are on oral anticoagulant, the novel things, rivaroxaban or dabigatran. These are the two we use. And if the patient has some kidney issues or some other issues, then maybe we can go for epexiban, which is, if the kidney issues are there, then epexiban is better. So as per the guidelines of the NOACs, we choose them, not depending upon the COVID, but which are good in, say, in renal disease, whose creatinine level was high and all. So you choose upon them. So usually renal patients, we are going for epexiban. Other patients, we are going for rivaroxaban or dabigatran. Usually we are going in the dose of, say, 20 milligram OD of rivaroxaban and probably 110 milligram BD of dabigatran. And epexiban, we are going 2.5 BD or OD depending upon the creatinine. And in the first wave, I have not used oral anticoagulants to people who were never admitted. In OPD basis, I never used in first wave because I thought mortality was not there and the inflammation was not there. Their CRPs never went high. They had mild symptoms. So I never used. But in the second wave, I have got few of my own patients whom I did not use oral anticoagulant had sudden deaths. So COVID patients, the saturation maintained, they have died on 12th day, 15th day, and nobody knows what happened. They were brought dead. So in second wave, I am putting rivaroxaban or dabigatran to all patients who are COVID. You may be thinking this is over treatment, but then after you learn that 2 or 3 of your young patients, no comorbidities, they just never woke up, and usually postmortem and all is not done. So
COVID is a pretty procoagulant state, as Sir discussed in his presentation, which was tried. So we give up to 2 months. We counsel that to the patients all.
Hospitalized patients, we are definitely following up. Those whose D-dimers were very high, we have followed them up to 3 months, and few people have taken Novax for 3 months till the D-dimer has stabilized. And what is the difference in OPD patients? In the first wave, we never used oral anticoagulants, and I have not seen any reported deaths also in my patient at least. But in this second wave, in the beginning, say 1.5 months back, few of my patients, 40 years, 42 years, no comorbidity, and they had deaths in their sleep also. So we don't know what happened. And so we have started oral anticoagulants for all COVID positive patients with significant symptoms, cough, body ache, fever. We are starting them now. You can stop them earlier than the hospitalized patients, but now we have started. So definitely this angle has changed from the 2 waves. And of course, those whose D-dimer are high, we definitely mention on the discharge card, and we keep monitoring their D-dimers, and we only stop when the D-dimer normalizes or it is more than 1 month.
So one has to be careful. Dr. Anis Agarwal, you have said something regarding this?
I think the line that is being followed is quite okay. We need to definitely continue oral anticoagulants when the patient is discharged. As far as the issue that is arising right now is monitoring them after discharge. Normally, once they leave us, we are not being able to follow up because of obviously want of manpower and capacity to handle that. Those who are on oral anticoagulants need to be regularly monitored. So that is one thing which should be told to them. If by chance, it can be done by a paramedical staff or whatever, the bleeding profile, the D-dimers, the regular checkup, they need to be taken care of. It's just not that you write it and we forget those patients. That's about it. I think rest, is being
Regarding D-dimer, I have one concern because all through our curriculum education, we have been taught that it has a high negative predictive value, more useful as a test. But I don't know how far we are going to correlate with high levels, high values of it with the clinical correlates, because all we thought was it's less than 0.3, we can virtually rule out pulmonary embolism. That's what we used to practice. But in COVID, I don't know exactly whether it's correlating to the patient's clinical condition or should we take it really seriously.
What I have noticed also in a lot of our patients, which we are seeing, the D-dimer is going off the charts. It's going so high, and then clinically the patient is totally all right. Mm-hmm. And that is when we wonder what exactly is going on. What do we need to do? We just can't take a call so easily. So again, this is something which we'll learn, I think, as we go along with the experience with this. Because there's nothing that is saying what we need to do.
Rule out pulmonary embolism. We used to do a D-dimer and be pretty happy if it was 0.1 and all. So we didn't use it as to start an anticoagulant therapy, or because definitely according to the pathophysiology, people are dying with only two things: lung fibrosis and clots. So definitely we need to give a novel oral anticoagulants for at least 2 months. So that's what, irrespective of the D-dimer, that's what we are doing.
So now actually we are coming to end, but there are few more questions have come just now. Question to Dr. Anis, I believe. How serious cytokine affect COVID-19 patients, and tofacitinib, how much effective to handle the cytokine storm? That was a question to Dr. Anis.
So what the studies are saying, it's not something that it is, you give it and everything is over. That is the first message I want to get across. Cytokine storm does happen. In patients, we are reducing the comorbidities, we are reducing the hospital stay, we are reducing the mortality by using it at the right time. That's about it as far as the handling of the cytokine storm is concerned. But then we have not been able to say that this is the treatment and we'll get away with it. That's not. We just reduce the mortality, we just reduce the hospital stay and definitely the post. The morbidities.
So I agree with Dr. Agarwal. Yes, it has a future. In some of the cases where we want to, patient are not responding, you want to use more anti-inflammatory apart from steroid. One of the study has clearly shown that it is beneficial.
It definitely is beneficial there.
And then Dr. Salil Bendre, you have got 2-3 questions to you. Early use of pirfenidone will prevent the interstitial pulmonary fibrosis. And then another thing, that pleiotropic action of pirfenidone does work on both the phases, like anti-inflammatory and anti-fibrotic.
Yeah, so
that was a question.
So the mechanism of action of pirfenidone we have already put up in the slides. So that has been clearly told about it, apoptotic action as well as the anti-inflammatory, also the cytokine related action. So I think that part is there in the presentation. We can again show them whenever who that particular doctor wants.
Yes.
As far as the role, I think as one of the panelists told, even in acute stages, pirfenidone has been used and it is being used, and it has shown to be effective. So even in the acute phase, but definitely so there in the chronic phase also. So both the places, but we don't have those kind of guidelines where we can structured say that it is absolutely a RCT controlled trial where we can vouch for it. But you can always use it. I don't think there is a no to that.
One more question, Salil, to you is how pirfenidone is effective in post-COVID, and does post-COVID fibrosis is reversible with the use of pirfenidone?
So we have again discussed this because we are seeing patients whose scans are improving and clinically they are improving. Their oxygen requirement has settled down even after 2 months or 3 months during follow-up. Their steroids have been tapered and even the pirfenidone has been stopped once the clinical symptomatic relief is there. 6-minute walk test shows a good improvement. So all these are pointers that not all, but most of the patients of post-COVID fibrosis show a significant resolution. There are some, even in my practice, who are still on oxygen, who still need to be continued or antifibrotics, but a very small group of patients.
Salil Vendre, somebody has specifically put you the question that how you manage the post-discharge VT in COVID patients, and what are the NOAC's choice for treatment?
So I think we discussed this as well.
Although it has been discussed, but somebody wanted you to answer.
I think what one more thing which is not part of this question, but please remember that physiotherapy plays a superb role and a very excellent role in post-COVID changes or even in active diseases where patients are able to do an incentive spirometry, not in those who are tachypneic and breathless, but we need to insist on physiotherapy and breathing exercises. That has almost 50% of their work is done by this physiotherapy. As far as the anticoagulation, I think we have been very clear with the options which we have in front of us, and we need to continue it for at least 4 to 6 weeks, even on oral treatment at home. So I think those parts have been clear during the discussion.
Yes, I agree. And then the last question, Salil, to you again. People even after declared COVID-free, what are the symptoms people will face and what are the treatment options? Although you have covered a lot, but still somebody has wanted to.
No, if they are
apart from lung, what are the other symptoms you have faced?
So COVID, as we all know, in the second wave, we are seeing a lot of GI side effects. Even CNS involvements are there. There are patients with extreme fatigue. And that is one symptom which I think many patients are going home with. Extreme fatigue, weakness, and exhaustion. Means apart from the respiratory rate coming to normal, even saturation touching 94, 95. But fatigue and exhaustion. This is one thing we need to really understand. Talking of antifibrotics, please remember that antifibrotics themselves cause a loss of appetite and they may also predispose to lack of nutritional intake because they are having an ailment on the liver. So if your patient complains of that, please do a liver function test as a regular monitoring. So you need to remember that. That's a very important.
Yes. Chetan and Dr. Samarin, you wanted to say post-COVID symptoms, especially fatigue one, what you suggest?
Yes, sir. For fatigue, especially, I have seen patients who are, getting high dose of vitamin C, at least 3 gram BD or 6 gram BD, doing well. So their fatigue is better managed with high dose of vitamin C, N-acetylcysteine, some kind of chelation therapy, with fluids, multivitamins. Early in the course of treatment is helping better compared to late initiation of treatment.
Samiran, you have to say something?
Post-COVID fatigue, I think it is partly physical and partly it is psychological.
Yes, I totally agree with you.
You have to counsel them, or you have to sometimes use certain medications which are used for fatigue syndromes. Certain drugs are used, mirtazapine or something that works sometimes. So definitely patients has gone through physically a lot, 5, 7 days on oxygen and ventilator, and also they take time. So usually 1 month you should give to them. And once patient has CT scan is showing minimal 5 to 10% fibrosis or fully recovered, still if the fatigue is going on, then psychosocial aspects should be thought about, and thinking them on the lines of chronic fatigue syndrome is there. One thing I want to point out that there are few papers which are there in US where they are saying that this virus, just like the HIV virus, can persist in the mast cells. So the virus can persist in the mast cells and there can be intermittent degranulation of the mast cells, and patient can develop wheezing, patient can develop cough, can develop rashes, can develop fatigue as well. So you have to distinguish between that whether this person is the initial, say, macrophage activation syndrome is what is the cytokine storm, and then it is going for mast cell activation syndrome, which is a chronic form. So this fatigue is one of the parts. If it is there with, say, bronchospasm, if it is there with rashes, if it is there with itching and fatigue, then this could be the mast cell activation, which is chronic. Virus has become chronically imbibed into the mast cell. So that is one or two papers I have gone across when I was studying this fatigue. So if all those 4-5 symptoms are there of mast cell degranulation, then the virus is persistent, and the treatment remains montelukast along with cetirizine. You might add, if a patient has these symptoms and fatigue, then montelukast and cetirizine or any of the antihistaminics will work. But if patient CT scan is normal, his 6-minute walk test is okay, and 1.5 months has passed, I think such a good amount of recovery is there, then probably you have to think of thinking of chronic fatigue syndrome or getting him out of his, maybe you take help of a psychologist or maybe sometimes extreme cases psychiatrist.
Thank you, Chetan. Thank you. Anis, you have to say something?
Sir, about
Being a rheumatologist, lot of rheumatology is also known for fatigue and pains and all the things.
So, but what I would definitely, what we've been seeing actually is most patients coming to us with post-COVID, after around 1 month or maybe less than a month or maybe 2 months sometimes, with arthritis, with reactive diseases, and in fact, they also come presenting with flare of their, ongoing rheumatoid diseases. So that is also something which you can expect, because the immune modulation has taken place, and patients may come up with, this could act as a trigger for, activating all the genetic rheumatoid diseases. So yes, we should definitely follow these patients up. And if there is nothing else, then as per Dr. Sumiran said, we look at the psychiatric aspect. But then sometimes I've seen around 30 plus patients of post-COVID reactive arthritis, and they have to be managed accordingly.
So let me conclude. I think we have exceeded another 30-40 minutes. So we have come to end of our discussion, and let me conclude that COVID is what I say just about very recent disease. We have experience of for about one and a half year, maximum you can say 15-16 months. One has to fine tune the drugs in the acute phase as well as in the post-COVID long haulers. A lot of things are going to come for the long haulers in future also. A lot of symptoms we have to deal with, but one has to use the drug judiciously, what I always have said and what I always practice. Fine tune them, see them, follow up them, and use whatever drugs is necessarily required. And still we have to learn a lot, especially in the long haulers. I think the time will make us much wiser that what should be the approach for the long haulers, especially we are the pulmonologists, especially a lot of lungs have been involved, and how they will behave, what is to be seen. I think the long-term follow-up will make us more wiser. And with these few take-home messages, I must thank all of you, Dr. Salil Bendre and Dr. Agrawal, then Dr. Chetan Kumar and Dr. Sumiran for your very clear viewpoints about most of the questions what people have faced, has put on us. So once again, I thank you all, and once again I thank the MSN people, who's probably Tanmay is heading here at present.
Yes, sir.
I must compliment him for doing a very useful webinar, because COVID is how much hours you discuss among yourselves is always less. So, but whatever major points I think we have tried to discuss, and I thank you once again, MSN, for giving us opportunity to talk among us and to say something about the COVID, and especially the post-COVID and long haulers and antifibrotics. So thank you very much, Dr. Tanmay. You want hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Dr. Rajendra. Thank you, Dr. Salil. Thank you, Dr. Anis, for your excellent presentation. And thank you, Dr. Sumiran and Dr. Chetan, for giving a your opinion regarding the COVID and fibrosis and cytokine storm. Thank you. And I'd like to share the 2 slides. Thank you. And we like to look forward your exclusive patronize on the world-class international quality brand, that is Fabilo, that is the brand of Heavy Rapid, Professionality brand of Tofados, that is, and Perfenidone, the brand name is Palmofib. Thank you. We may be the younger player, but our drive and enthusiasm are the best in associating with you. Thank you for joining for this world-class program, sir. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Salil. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you all, Adian.
Good night.
Thank you.
Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Agarwal. Be safe. Yes.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.